Hettinger County, North Dakota, November 1914. The cold that year did not arrive gradually. It did not give warning. On the third day of the month, the temperature dropped 31 degrees in 4 hours, and it kept dropping. By nightfall, the thermometer outside Halverson's feed and grain read 14 below zero. By morning, it read lower still. Families across the county had already begun burning through their winter wood at a rate no one had planned for. The Peterson family on the North Road burned through their first cord in 8 days. The Brandt brothers, who had cut more timber than anyone in the valley that autumn, started rationing by the second week of November. Cattle died standing in fields. A milk cow belonging to Emil Torvalson froze solid overnight. No one had seen a cold snap arrive this hard, this fast, this early. At the western edge of the Cannonball River Basin, something different was happening. From the road, the structure looked unfinished. It looked wrong. The roof barely cleared the ground. The entrance was a low tunnel, angled south, packed with sod on 3 sides. A stranger passing might have taken it for a collapsed root cellar or an abandoned drainage project. There was no smoke rising, no sound of chopping wood, no stack of split timber leaning against the outside wall. But inside, something no one had expected was taking shape. Her name was Ingrid Brattland. She was 34 years old. She had come to Hettinger County as a bride in 1903, and she had stayed after everything else left her. She was not a large woman. She was not a loud one. What people remembered about her, later, was her hands, wide across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, steady even when they should not have been. They stopped believing she would fail on November 19, 1914. Ingrid had not expected to become a widow at 31. No one does. Her husband, Oscar Brattland, had died on a Wednesday morning in March of 1911. He was crossing the Cannonball River with a load of salvaged timber on a wagon. The ice gave way at the center channel. The horses panicked. Oscar went under. They pulled him out a quarter-mile downstream. He was already gone. He was 36 years old. He left behind 2 children, Marta, who was 7 at the time of his death, and young Tor, who had just turned 4. He left behind a land claim of 160 acres, most of it unbroken. He left behind a debt of $214 owed to the First Agricultural Bank of Mott, which came due the following September. He left behind a cord and a half of wood, a lame horse, and a stone and sod house with a cracked north wall that let the wind through like a living thing. The community of Hettinger did what communities did in those years. They helped briefly, and then they expected her to make a decision. The expectation, unspoken but understood, was that she would give up the claim, that she would take her children to Mott or to relatives somewhere east, that she would stop pretending a woman alone could work 160 acres and meet a bank note and survive a Dakota winter without a man beside her. She did not go. She stayed. And that decision, more than anything else, was what drew the cruelty out of certain people. Aldrich Finney, who ran the dry goods counter at Halverson's, told 3 men in September of 1913 that Ingrid Brattland had lost her practical sense along with her husband. He did not say it quietly. He said it at the counter on a Saturday when the store held a dozen people. She heard it. She bought her flour and her salt, and she did not answer him. Martin Over, the land agent for the Federal Homestead Commission in Hettinger County, had been watching her claim with the particular attention that men in his position reserved for land they expected to reclaim. He visited twice in 1913. He was polite both times. He spoke about assistance programs and resettlement options in the valley near Bismarck. He left his card both times. She did not keep it. What neither of these men knew, and what the county did not know, was what Ingrid carried in her memory from her father's farm outside Aalesund, Norway, where she had grown up watching her father build structures into the earth that held heat the way stone holds the sun, slowly, completely, and long after the source of that heat was gone. Her father had been a stonemason. Not a famous one, not a wealthy one, but a precise one. He had built root cellars and earthen barns and one low stone house that his family lived in through Norwegian winters that would have shamed even a Dakota cold snap. He had explained to young Ingrid, sitting beside him as he worked mortar between stones with his thumb, that the earth itself was a stove, that it asked only to be enclosed correctly. That mass held warmth the way a full stomach holds a meal, not forever, but long enough to matter. She had been 12 years old when he told her that. She had been 33 when she decided to trust it. The morning Ingrid walked into Halverson's general store and told Aldrich Finney she would need 40 pounds of clay-mixed mortar, 6 lengths of salvaged pine board, and credit on a bag of lime. The store held 7 people. It was October 4th, 1914. The first hard frost had already come and gone, and the men of Hettinger County were deep in their winter preparations. Timber was being stacked. Stoves were being inspected. Everyone was thinking about wood. Finney set both hands on the counter and looked at her list. Harold Gust, who had built 23 structures across 4 counties in 31 years and survived every Dakota winter since 1883, was standing near the nail bins. He was a large man with a gray beard and the particular confidence of someone whose knowledge had never been seriously challenged. He looked at Ingrid's list. Then he looked at her. "You're putting stone into a hillside," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Clay mortar cracks and frost. You're sealing caves by January. You'll be back in timber by Christmas." He said it without cruelty. He said it the way a man says something he considers simply true. "I've seen women try this kind of build. I've never seen one that held." Ingrid picked up her bag of lime. "I know," she said. 2 words. Then she walked to the counter. Martin Over was there that same morning. He had arrived with paperwork. He set it beside the register while Finney tallied her order, and he spoke without looking at her directly. There was a provision, he explained, under the Homestead Improvement Act, by which uncultivated claims could be reviewed for productivity compliance. Her 160 acres had shown insufficient cultivation progress over the prior 24 months. He had filed a preliminary review notice with the Mott office on October 1st. She would have until March 1st, 1915, to demonstrate productive use of the land, or the claim would enter reassessment. He placed the notice on top of her mortar bag. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket. She paid what she owed and carried her supplies to the wagon without speaking again. Outside, Marta was waiting on the bench with Tor asleep against her shoulder. Ingrid loaded the wagon. She climbed up. She did not explain what had happened inside. She clicked the horse forward and drove home on the frozen road without speaking, and the only sound was the wind coming down off the open plain and the creak of the wagon wheels on hard ground. She broke ground on October 7th. The hillside she had chosen faced south-southwest, set back 40 feet from the creek bank where a natural rise of ground gave her 11 feet of usable earth above the floor line. She had studied that hillside for 2 years. She had walked it in every season. She knew where the water ran in spring. She knew where the ground stayed dry in July. She knew the clay content of the soil at 3 feet down was dense enough to hold its form without additional reinforcement if packed correctly. She dug the main chamber first, 14 feet wide, 18 feet deep into the hill, 7 feet floor to ceiling at the center peak. She moved 4 tons of earth by hand over 9 days. Using a short-handled spade and a wooden sledge, she pulled herself when Marta was at school. Her back bent under the weight of each load. By the end of the 3rd day, her palms had opened and healed and opened again, and she packed them at night with tallow and wrapped them in cloth torn from an old shirt. The blisters became calluses. The calluses cracked. She kept working. The north wall she built entirely from flat sandstone pulled from the creek bed, carried up in a sling across her shoulders, 6 to 8 stones per trip. She set them in courses using a mortar she mixed herself, 3 parts creek clay, 1 part lime, a measure of dry grass fiber pressed in to resist cracking. Her father had taught her that. The grass fiber acted as a binder. It held the mortar flexible through freeze and thaw rather than letting it shatter brittle in the cold. The entrance tunnel she angled 22 degrees off true south. Her father's instruction. Direct south caught winter wind. The angle deflected it. The tunnel itself was 6 feet long and 4 feet high, low enough that a person had to bow entering, which meant warm air stayed trapped inside rather than rushing out every time the door opened. She packed the tunnel walls with an additional 8 inches of sod on each side. The ceiling she lined with birch bark laid in overlapping sheets, then covered with 14 inches of packed earth above the bark layer. Birch bark shed moisture. The earth above it acted as a second thermal mass. Her father had used the same method on his potato cellar in Alisund, and that cellar had never frozen in 19 years of Norwegian winters. By the end of the 2nd week, her thumbnail on her left hand had turned black where a sandstone block had shifted and caught it. She did not stop. She wrapped it at night and worked with it in the morning and did not mention it to the children. Marta, who was 10 years old and serious in the way that children become serious when they have watched grief work on a parent, helped where she could. She mixed mortar on the flat board outside the entrance. She carried water from the creek in a wooden bucket, 2 trips each evening. After school, she did not ask questions about what they were building. She washed her mother's hands, and she mixed when she was told to mix, and she carried when she was told to carry. Tor, who was 7, dragged small stones from the creek bank in a flour sack. He could not carry much, but he brought what he could, and he set each stone near the entrance with the particular solemnity of a child who understands that the work matters even if he does not fully understand why. On the 14th day of building, a neighbor named Rolf Skog came down the creek road on horseback and stopped when he saw the opening in the hillside. "Root cellar," he called. Ingrid looked up from the entrance. "No," she said. Skog looked at the low tunnel entrance, at the mounded earth above it, at the absence of any timber frame or visible wall structure. He nodded slowly in the way people nod when they have decided not to pursue a conversation further. He rode on without another word. By early November, the structure was sealed. The interior held a small iron stove, second-hand, purchased from a departing family in Mott for $2.40, set at the center of the north wall where the thermal mass was greatest. 2 sleeping platforms built from salvaged pine boards ran along the east and west walls. A shelf above each platform held what food stores she had managed to put by. The floor was packed clay, tamped smooth, covered in dry grass laid flat. She moved herself and the children in on November 6, 1914. The temperature that night dropped to 9 below zero. She lit the stove at 6 in the evening. She burned 3 logs. By 8 o'clock, the interior temperature had reached 61 degrees Fahrenheit. She let the fire go out at 9. She and Marta and Tor slept under wool blankets on the pine platforms, and when Ingrid woke at 4 in the morning, the interior temperature had dropped to 54 degrees. Outside, the thermometer she had mounted to a stake near the entrance read 17 below zero, a difference of 71 degrees. No fire burning. The first person to see the numbers was a man named Einar Voss. He was a dry goods hauler who ran supplies between Mott and the outlying claims twice a month, and he had known Ingrid Brattland since the year she and Oscar had arrived in the county. He was not a man who dealt in opinions. He dealt in weights and distances and road conditions, and he trusted what he could measure. He came by on the morning of November 9th to deliver a sack of cornmeal she had ordered in October. He tied his horse at the creek bank and walked up toward the structure and stopped when he saw her outside, splitting kindling in a light coat. The temperature that morning was 11 below zero. He was wearing 2 wool coats and a buffalo hide across his shoulders, and he was still cold. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel and looked at her. "You're not burning much," he said. "No," she said. He looked at the exterior. No wood smoke. No stack of split timber beside the entrance. A small pile of logs. He counted 9, resting against the south face of the hill. He set down the cornmeal sack and ducked into the entrance tunnel and stood inside for a moment. He did not speak. He pressed his bare palm flat against the north stone wall and held it there. The stone was not warm, but it was not cold either. It held the particular neutral temperature of something that had been absorbing slow heat for days and had stopped giving it up. He looked at the small thermometer Ingrid had mounted to the interior wall beside the stove. It read 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove was cold. It had not been lit since the previous evening. He came back out and looked at her for a long moment. "That's not right," he said, not unkindly. He meant it as a factual observation. "It is right," she said. She went back to splitting kindling. Einar Voss picked up his cornmeal sack, set it just inside the tunnel entrance, and walked back to his horse. He did not tell anyone what he had seen that morning. Not yet. He was a man who needed to see a thing more than once before he spoke about it. Winter had barely started. The real test was still coming. Ingrid stacked the kindling inside the entrance tunnel and did not think about Einar Voss or what he had measured or what he might say. She thought about the 9 logs stacked outside and whether they would be enough, and decided they would be, and went inside to start the morning meal. Before we go further, has anyone in your family ever built something like this to survive? A root cellar turned shelter, an earthen room, something dug into a hillside or carved from a riverbank? Share it below. I genuinely want to know. These stories are everywhere, in family memories and old letters and things grandparents said once and were never asked to repeat. Drop it in the comments. Your answers always make these stories richer. The real storm announced itself the way the worst ones do, not loudly, but quietly. On the morning of November 17th, the sky above Hettinger County turned the particular flat white that old-timers in the region called a dead sky. No cloud definition, no horizon line, just a seamless pale, nothing from edge to edge. The air went completely still. Animals felt it before people did. Ingrid's horse pressed itself into the corner of the small lean-to she had built against the east face of the hill and would not eat. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 14 degrees in 3 hours. By 4 o'clock, it was dropping faster. The wind arrived at dusk, not gradually, not as a building gust, but as a wall. It came out of the northwest at what felt like a single moment of decision, and once it came, it did not vary or ease. It simply pressed. It found every gap in every structure in the county, and it pushed through without asking. In Hettinger and across the Cannonball Basin, families began burning wood at emergency rates. Harold Gust's timber cabin on the North Road, which he had built himself over 2 summers from white pine logs averaging 10 inches across, was losing heat through the walls faster than his stove could replace it. By 9 that evening, he was burning 6 logs every 4 hours. His interior temperature, measured on a wall thermometer he had owned for 11 years, read 39 degrees Fahrenheit with the stove at full draw. The Peterson family, 2 miles east, had already burned through 18 logs by midnight, and their youngest child was sleeping in her coat. Martin Over, the land agent, had a frame house in town with a parlor stove and a kitchen range burning simultaneously. His wood supply, which he had considered more than adequate in October, had dropped to less than a cord remaining by the morning of November 18th. He sent his hired man out in the dark to buy more from the Brandt brothers at a price he did not discuss publicly. Outside, the temperature reached 29 below zero at its lowest recorded point on the night of November 18th. The wind pushed the felt temperature lower still. A cedar post on the Skog property split clean down the center from the cold. A sound, neighbors reported, like a rifle shot in the dark. Inside Ingrid Brattland's stone hut, the temperature at 10 o'clock that evening read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. She had lit the stove once that day. She had burned 4 logs over 3 hours in the late afternoon, enough to bring the interior up from its morning reading of 53 degrees. Then she let it die down. The thermal mass of the stone walls, 2,800 pounds of sandstone and clay mortar set into a hillside, holding 11 feet of earth above the roof line, had absorbed that heat and was releasing it back at the pace of geology rather than combustion. Slowly, evenly, without drama. Harold Gust's cabin, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, burning 6 logs every 4 hours. Ingrid Brattland's stone hut, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire out since 7 o'clock. The Peterson family, 18 logs burned and still cold. Ingrid Brattland, 4 logs burned total that day. Marta did her schoolwork by lamplight on the pine shelf beside her sleeping platform. Tor had fallen asleep before 8, curled on his side with one arm around a cloth dog Ingrid had sewn him the previous Christmas. Ingrid sat near the cold stove and mended a seam in her work coat and listened to the wind outside press against 11 feet of packed Dakota earth and find nothing to push through. The storm had been building for 6 hours. It would not peak for another 2 days, and it would not break for 11. Part 4. On the morning of November 20th, the 3rd day of the storm, Marta woke with a fever. Ingrid knew it before she touched the girl's forehead. She knew it from the sound of her breathing, shallow and fast, with a catch at the top of each inhale that had not been there the night before. She pressed her palm to Marta's cheek. The skin was dry and hot in the particular way that meant the fever had been building for hours already, quietly, while everyone slept. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 33 below zero. The wind had not eased in 61 hours. There was no doctor within 14 miles. The road to Hettinger was impassable. Ingrid had checked it at first light. She could see 8 feet from the entrance tunnel before the blowing snow became a wall of white nothing. The horse was alive in its lean-to, pressed against the hill. She had fed it that morning by feel, moving along the exterior wall with one hand touching stone the whole way. She came back inside and sat beside Marta and thought clearly and without panic, the way her father had taught her to think when the situation was serious. He had said, when the problem is large, make the list small. What do you have? What do you need? What can you do right now? She had willow bark. She had dried it herself in September, strips of it hanging from the ceiling of the old sod house, before she moved the children into the stone hut. She boiled water on the stove and steeped the bark for 20 minutes and cooled it and gave it to Marta in a tin cup. She changed the wool blanket for a dry one. She moved toward to her own sleeping platform so Marta had the full width of hers. Then she made the decision that cost her the most. The stove had been burning low since morning, just enough to keep the interior above 55 degrees. She let it go out completely, not because she wanted to, because she needed to know. She needed to know, with Marta sick and the road gone and the storm refusing to break, whether the structure alone, the stone and the earth and the mass of it, would hold without any fire at all. If it could not, she needed to know now, while she still had 7 logs remaining and the choice of burning them all at once. She let the fire die at 11 in the morning. She sat beside Marta and she watched the thermometer. 1 hour, 53 degrees. 2 hours, 49 degrees. She wet a cloth and laid it across Marta's forehead and did not look at the thermometer for a while. Tor sat at the foot of his sister's platform with his knees pulled up and his eyes on his mother's face. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked. Ingrid smoothed the cloth on Marta's forehead. "She is going to be all right," she said. "The house is keeping us." 3 hours, 47 degrees. Then it stopped falling. She checked again at the 4-hour mark. Still 47 degrees. The stone walls had reached their lower equilibrium, the point at which the heat stored in 2,800 pounds of sandstone and packed clay and 11 feet of Dakota earth exactly balanced the slow cold seeping in from outside, where the temperature had not risen above 29 below zero in 3 days. The structure had found its floor. It would not drop further without fire. It would simply hold. 47 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire. 33 below zero outside. A difference of 80 degrees. Maintained by earth and stone, and the memory of 4 logs burned 2 days prior. Ingrid lit the stove again at 4 in the afternoon. She burned 2 logs over 90 minutes. By 6 o'clock, the interior had returned to 58 degrees. Marta's fever broke sometime in the night. By morning, she was sitting up, asking for cornmeal, complaining that Tor had taken her blanket. The storm did not break until November 27th, 11 days from first wind to last. When the sky finally cleared, it did so completely, the way Dakota skies do, all at once, blue from edge to edge, the sun brilliant and cold and offering no warmth whatsoever. The temperature outside read 19 below zero in the new silence. Ingrid had burned 13 logs total across the full 11 days. Harold Gust had burned 114. The Peterson family had burned through their entire winter supply and sent their eldest son to bed cord wood from the Brandt brothers on day 8. He made the trip in conditions that left 2 of his toes blackened. On the morning of November 28th, Einar Voss came up the creek road again. He was the first person through after the storm. He had a load of supplies for 3 claims, and he had been thinking about that thermometer reading since November 9th, and he had decided he needed to see it again. He came expecting, at some level, to find what people expected to find after 11 days of the worst cold in 40 years. A structure compromised. A woman who had managed but barely. Evidence that the limits of the idea had been reached. He tied his horse at the creek bank and walked up through snow that reached his hip in the drifts and his knee in the open ground. He was sweating by the time he reached the entrance tunnel. He was wearing both wool coats again and the buffalo hide, and he was still cold in the way that 19 below zero makes every living thing cold regardless of what it wears. He ducked into the entrance tunnel. He heard, before he saw anything, the sound of an axe. He came out the other side of the tunnel into the interior and found it empty. He stood for a moment. He looked at the thermometer. It read 59 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove was cold. He pressed his palm flat against the north stone wall. The same neutral warmth as before, but deeper now. The stones had been absorbing heat for 3 weeks, and they had stored it the way old things store everything, thoroughly and without show. He removed his buffalo hide without thinking about it. Then he removed one wool coat. He stood in the second coat and looked at the thermometer again, and then he went back through the tunnel and followed the sound of the axe around the south face of the hill. Ingrid was splitting wood. Not urgently. Not in the desperate rhythm of someone making up a deficit. She was splitting wood the way a person splits wood when they have enough and are simply maintaining. Her breath came in slow clouds in the cold air. She did not look up immediately. 11 days, Einar said. She set another log on the block. 11 days, she said. He looked at the small pile of split timber beside the entrance. He counted what remained. He looked back at her. "How many logs?" he said. 13, she said. "Total." He removed his hat. He held it in both hands and looked at the ground for a moment the way men look at the ground when they are recalculating something they were certain about. Then he looked at the structure, at the mounded earth above the entrance, at the sandstone facing on the north exposure, at the angled tunnel entrance that deflected the wind. He put his hat back on. "I need to bring someone here," he said. "Bring whoever you like," she said. She set the axe down and picked up the split wood and carried it inside, and he stood in 19 below zero and watched her go. Harold Gust came 2 days later. He came alone, without announcement. He walked the exterior of the structure twice, stopping to press his hand against the sandstone facing, looking at the angle of the entrance tunnel, studying the roofline where earth met the natural hillside grade. He spent 19 minutes inside. He looked at the thermometer 3 times. He examined the mortar joints on the north wall with his thumbnail. He crouched at the floor level and pressed his palm flat against the packed clay. When he came out, Ingrid was feeding the horse. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel for a moment. "I was wrong," he said. She nodded once. She went back to feeding the horse. That was enough. The first family came on December 3rd. It was not the Gusts. It was not the Petersons. It was a young couple named Anders and Britt Halvorsen, who had arrived in Hettinger County only 14 months earlier from a farm outside Trondheim, and who had spent the 11-day storm burning through nearly every log they had cut that autumn. Anders Halvorsen came with his hat in his hands and a notebook tucked under his arm, and he asked Ingrid if she would show him how the north wall was built. She showed him. She did not lecture. She did not explain at length. She walked him through the structure the way her father had walked her through his cellar in Alisund, pointing at specific things, naming specific materials, letting the numbers speak for themselves. She told him the mortar mixture. She told him the ceiling depth. She told him about the angle of the entrance tunnel and why it mattered. She told him the grass fiber in the mortar was not optional. Anders Halvorsen wrote everything in his notebook in a careful hand and thanked her and left. He broke ground on a hillside structure on December 11th. His wife Britt mixed mortar beside him in temperatures that dropped to 22 below zero during the build. They moved in before Christmas. Einar Voss told the story on his supply route. He was not a man given to exaggeration, and that made the telling more effective than any enthusiastic account would have been. He stated facts, temperatures, log counts, days of storm. He stated them the same way to every claim he visited between Mott and the Cannonball Basin, and people listened the way they listen to a man who measures things for a living and does not embellish. By January of 1915, 4 families in Hettinger County had begun hillside structures based on what Ingrid had built. 3 of them came to her directly with questions. She answered every question. She turned no one away. She charged nothing. Harold Gust came back in January with his own notebook. He was not a man who found humility easily, and it sat on him visibly. A slight stiffness in how he held himself, a carefulness in how he phrased his questions, as though precision might substitute for the grace he was finding difficult to locate. But he came. He asked real questions, and he wrote down real answers, and by February he was incorporating packed earth rooflines and angled entrance tunnels into the structures he built for other families. He never publicly credited her by name in the first year, but he stopped saying the idea would fail. And in a county where Harold Gust's opinion carried the weight of 31 years and 23 structures, that silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Martin Over's productivity review of Ingrid Brattland's claim was quietly closed in February of 1915. There was no announcement. The paperwork simply stopped. Einar Voss later said he believed someone in the Mott office had decided that pursuing the review of a woman whose survival story was being repeated across 4 counties was not a productive use of institutional attention. Whatever the reason, Over did not visit the claim again. His card, which Ingrid had never kept, was not missed. By the winter of 1915 to 1916, the Earthen hillside method had spread beyond Hettinger County. Families in Stark County to the east were building variations of the structure. A homesteader in Slope County near the Montana border wrote a letter to the Mott Pioneer newspaper describing a stone and earth shelter he had built after hearing the account from a supply hauler, almost certainly Einar Voss, and reporting that his interior temperature had held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit through a 3-day cold snap, without any fire burning at all. The letter was printed in March of 1916 and generated more reader correspondence than any letter the paper had published that year. By 1918, the method had reached as far as northeastern Montana and the eastern edge of Wyoming Territory. It traveled the way practical knowledge travels in isolated places, person to person, claim to claim, carried in notebooks and repeated at grain exchanges, and passed between women at church steps in the particular quiet way that women pass survival knowledge when the men are not listening carefully enough to hear it. Ingrid Brattland lived on her 160-acre claim until 1941. She never left Hettinger County. She never wrote anything down about what she had built or why it worked. She did not need to. By the time she was old, there were people in 4 states who were warm in winter because of a method they had learned at 2 or 3 removes from a woman on the Cannonball River Basin who had learned it from her father in Norway and trusted it when no one else would. Marta Brattland, who had mixed mortar on a flat board at 10 years old and carried water from the creek in a wooden bucket, grew up and married a farmer in Stark County and built a hillside structure on her own claim in the winter of 1924. She built the entrance tunnel at 22 degrees off true south, exactly as her mother had done. She used 3 parts creek clay, 1 part lime, and dry grass fiber pressed in to resist cracking. Her interior temperature held at 56 degrees Fahrenheit through a 4-day freeze without fire. She had learned it the way all the best knowledge is learned. Not from a book, not from an expert, from watching someone she loved do a hard thing correctly and remembering every detail of how it was done. The stone hut still stands today at the western edge of what was once the Brattland claim, now private farmland along the Cannonball River Basin in Hettinger County. The north wall, 110 years old, holds its mortar joints intact. The sandstone courses her hand set in October of 1914 have not shifted. If you press your palm flat against that stone on a cold day, the way Einar Voss pressed his palm flat in November of 1914, you will find it neither warm nor cold. You will find it holding, still holding. The way things hold when they are built with knowledge rather than confidence, with patience rather than speed, and with the understanding that the earth itself is not an obstacle to survival, but its most reliable partner. Sometimes the people who are told they will fail are simply the ones who remembered something everyone else forgot. And sometimes the difference between freezing and enduring is not a larger fire. It is a better wall. If you want more forgotten stories of courage from the American frontier, subscribe. These histories deserve to be remembered.